Welcome to NewYorkBIOs Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020 featuring fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Amy Walker of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization and Joe LaPorte from PHC Corporation of North America, discussing the landscape and distribution of vaccines against COVID-19 in 2021.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks-Bland, and I am the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We're thrilled that you're joining us today. This is a big week in healthcare, in politics, actually just in America. And so what better way to have a NewYorkBIO webinar talking about current events and with people in the know than to talk about vaccines and vaccine distribution. So we're thrilled to have Amy Walker and Joe LaPorte joining us, and we are going to delve into things. This is a little different in the format than you've seen us do over the course of 2020. Normally, Derek and I have one guest, and we do a fireside chat. Today, we're doing a little bit more of a panel format to have more expertise brought in, because Derek and I, while we can ask questions, we are not the experts. So that's why we have Amy and Joe joining us. Derek, I will kick it over to you to introduce our guest. Oh, and a reminder, as always, you can use the chat or the Q&A feature to ask your questions. We will be using some slides and going through some slides today. So go ahead and type your questions in when you have them, and then we'll be able to turn to them when we have the chance to ask Amy and Joe questions. Thanks so much. Derek, over to you.
Okay, sure. So I will tee this up. So the way that we'll go first, we will have Amy Walker from Bio. Amy is the Director for Infectious Disease Policy. And what we'll do is Jennifer and Amy will kick it off and talk infectious disease policy and vaccines to start. And then we will funnel over to Joe LaPorte, who's from PHC Corporation, who many of you may have previously known as Panasonic Healthcare. And we'll talk about kind of the final stages of the cold chain. Once we actually get the vaccines out of the R&D sites, out of the manufacturing sites, how do we actually get them to the arms of patients? This has been a big topic and really a big issue for the last little while. The incoming Biden administration has said that they want to have 100 million doses into the arms of patients in their first 100 days. It's a lofty goal, and I think I kind of speak for everybody that we've been looking forward to trying to actually get vaccines and herd immunity to turn the corner, and this is going to be a huge step. So Jennifer and Amy, I will kick it over to you. I have Amy's slides and I'll be advancing them. So let me pull those up. And Amy, you let me know when you want me to share my screen.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Derek. So Amy, what we're going to do, and for everyone, is we're going to pull Amy's slide deck up and let you walk through the slides. Amy and her colleague, Phyllis Arthur at Bio, have literally been working around the clock for probably we're closing in on a year, right? As you realize sort of what was coming down the pike at the end of January last year. And they have been instrumental in developing policies that impact not only who receives the vaccine, but how our biotech essential workers can continue to operate. We've been able to stay in the lab. Things that look different over the last year, but we've been able to continue to advance therapeutics and treatments. And it's in large part due to the work that Amy and her colleagues have done. So Amy, take it away with your slides, and then we'll pop back in for questions when you're done.
Wonderful, thank you. Thanks for the invitation today. I'm going to be providing a brief update on the status of COVID-19 vaccine R&D and distribution. And I'm going to attempt to cover a lot in just a few minutes, so I'm happy to elaborate on any of these issues during the Q&A. And if I could get my slides up.
Yep.
Wonderful. We can go to slide 2, please. So since COVID-19 hit the international stage just about a year ago, more than 830 drug development programs have been initiated for antivirals, treatments for the impacts of COVID-19 disease, and vaccines. Vaccines make up about a quarter of the total pipeline, with nearly 200 candidates in development. And 95% of the vaccine programs were initiated from scratch, but utilizing existing platforms, making the progress we've seen in the past 12 months even more remarkable. In comparison, during the SARS outbreak back in 2003, it took 20 months from the time the genome was sequenced until a vaccine candidate was developed, and we still don't have a proven vaccine for that virus. Next slide. So as I'm sure everyone's aware, 2 vaccines have already been authorized by the FDA for use. Pfizer and Moderna's mRNA vaccines were approved for use under the FDA's emergency use authorization. The EUA pathway exists to allow earlier use of products during public health emergencies. The goal is to move towards a full approval under a biologics license application, or BLA, the FDA standard for medicines and vaccines, once we have more long-term data on the efficacy and safety of these vaccines. Additionally, the CanSino Bio, Gamaleya Research Institute, and AstraZeneca vaccines are in use already outside the US. There are a number of vaccines that are in phase 3, and we anticipate review of the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines here in the US in the first half of 2021. The CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP, is meeting next week to tee up discussions of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, with the expectation that they could be filing with the FDA in the next few weeks, as their trial is now fully enrolled and the case counts are increasing as COVID cases increase. You can also see on this slide that there are a variety of vaccine technologies being tested. These could have different efficacy levels, safety profiles, and may end up being recommended for different populations. We needed a lot of shots on goal because we didn't know what would be effective, but all of these different technologies, if they do prove to be successful, could add a lot of complexity to the distribution process. Next slide. Shown on this slide is the general review and distribution pathway. The FDA reviews the vaccine for safety and efficacy. CDC makes a recommendation for what populations it should be used in. And then the manufacturer works with the distributor to kit the vaccines and get it out to administration sites. As long as the vaccine is being used, there is also safety and efficacy monitoring by the FDA and CDC. Next slide. This slide has more specifics about how the COVID vaccines are actually rolling out. Given the logistical complexity of their cold chain requirements, Pfizer's vaccines are being shipped directly from the manufacturing sites to the site of administration. Moderna's vaccine is being distributed through a central distributor, McKesson, where a kit with ancillary supplies like syringes, gloves, and vaccination cards is paired with the vaccine. McKesson then distributes the vaccine out to the sites of care. It's anticipated that other vaccines will follow this model with the central distribution, and I will not get too far into distribution, knowing that Joe is going to cover that in much more detail. Next slide.
Amy,
yes.
I was just going to ask if we can go back one. One thing that I think people have a question about, and I know I've certainly got questions, is how the COVID vaccine distribution process differs from your normal vaccine distribution process. Because cold chain is not new, granted at these levels, and Joe's going to talk to us about those specifics. That is new. But what about how are normal vaccines that we receive in the pediatrician's office, or flu vaccines, how are they distributed today?
So, typically it's a little bit more like the Moderna model, where there's a central distributor. So vaccine manufacturers work with either individual providers, hospital systems, practices, or the CDC for the CDC handles the Vaccines for Children's program for the special population of underinsured children to contract, negotiate prices, and then it gets pushed out from their, distributors to those sites of care.
Yeah, having worked at Merck, I've been through some of our distribution centers and working with third parties, but not everyone understands just how the general process works as well.
Yeah, and just briefly touching on the cold chain issue, Pfizer does require the ultra cold chain, but Moderna's vaccine is more like the cold chain requirements for the chickenpox vaccine. So the Moderna vaccine is a little bit more like your routine immunizations that we handle on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay. So manufacturing typically begins when a vaccine is in late stage development, but given the ongoing pandemic, manufacturing of vaccine doses began earlier in the clinical trials process at risk. We didn't know what technologies would ultimately be successful, but the federal government provided procurement contracts through Operation Warp Speed to de-risk and jumpstart manufacturing so that doses would be immediately available once a vaccine was authorized or approved. So through all of the Operation Warp Speed contracts, the federal government has commitments and options of up to 900 million doses. Obviously, this is more than the American people need for the initial rounds of vaccinations. So in the instance that all these vaccines are ultimately successful, doses may be held and used in the event that COVID becomes a routine vaccine, or doses could also be donated to other countries as well. Next slide,
question.
please.
When you say a dose, does that mean a full set, both in a primer and a booster, or is that each individual dose?
That's each individual dose. So
okay.
The US has about 300 million people. So, about 600 million doses would cover the entire US population.
Right.
So if you look at, and so like looking at your chart there, if you look at the Moderna, 100 million doses originally contracted, right? Plus the 100 million, the additional 100 million from December means that's 100 million people.
Yes.
Be dosed because Moderna has two. But now, Amy, not all of these vaccines being tested are a 2-dose regimen, correct?
Correct. So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that we are anticipating could be, reviewed by the FDA sometime in February or March is a 1-dose vaccine.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So while doses were available back in December when the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were authorized, not enough doses are available for all Americans currently. Production is ramping up. Pfizer is on track to hit their contract obligations of 100 million doses by March. And Operation Warp Speed recently said that they anticipate 30 million doses per month from each manufacturer over the next couple months. This chart shows how the distribution strategy will shift based upon the number of doses available. When supply is initially constrained, vaccination is focused on high-risk populations, with the broader population receiving vaccines as more doses are available. In the future, whether COVID becomes a routine vaccine like flu depends on a number of factors. The duration of protection of the vaccines, the rate of virus mutations that impact the vaccine efficacy, and the epidemiology of the disease post-vaccination. Next slide.
Oh, wait, Amy.
Yes.
Go back. Sorry, Derek.
No problem.
So so when you look at this, because certainly I think there's been a lot of discussion, arguably some confusion. I know a number, right? I mean, all of us probably on this phone are the age that have parents that are, in their 60s or older. And so people are trying to help their, loved ones get scheduled for vaccines and that sort of thing. Where, based on what you know now, if Pfizer completes their dose commitment to the US to Operation Warp Speed by March, did you say?
Yes, that's when it's anticipated. And they'll continue to be manufacturing additional vaccines. And I know that there's been discussions with leadership at Operation Warp Speed and HHS for additional doses to be procured for the US for Pfizer, but that's still under discussion, it seems.
Right, okay. And then as far as, so most people then in your slide would be in the blue, like probably most of us on the phone would be somewhere in the darker blue in the middle, right?
Yes. So yeah, it seems like if we want to use the CDC's categorizations, phase 1A is the lighter blue, phase 1B, 1C, and 2 is that darker blue, and then the green is kind of the future looking general population routine vaccination.
We actually also had a question about the rollout for pediatric populations.
So yes, the Pfizer vaccine is currently approved for individuals age 16 years and older, and Moderna is 18 years and older. Both of those manufacturers are starting to age down their and do studies in adolescents, and will continue to age down. Given the epidemiology early on in the pandemic, there was a much larger focus on adults, particularly older adults, given that they were being the hardest hit with COVID. We do anticipate recommendations for pediatric populations in the future, but in terms of timing of when those may come around, I think that that's probably not likely until probably the second half of 2021 at the earliest, just because those trials are still ongoing.
Yeah, my 15-year-old who turned 15 in October has asked me no less than like once a week when I am planning to enroll him in a clinical trial.
Yeah, and there was an article last week as well, kind of highlighting the challenges that Moderna was facing. They were looking for 3,000 adolescents to enroll in their clinical trials, and it seemed like they were encountering some difficulties getting to that number. So, the longer it takes to enroll patients in those trials, the longer it will be until we have that data and potentially a recommendation.
Thanks.
So if we go to the next slide, please. So I briefly referenced this on the last slide, but while the supply is constrained, CDC has developed a framework for prioritization of doses. I'm sure that this is all something that you are relatively familiar with at this point, but as a review, CDC's Phase 1A includes frontline healthcare workers and long-term care staff and residents. Phase 1B includes essential workers and individuals over age 75 years. Phase 1C includes any remaining essential workers, individuals over age 65, and adults younger than age 65 who have underlying health conditions that put them at risk for severe COVID-19 cases. Last week, HHS advised states to move those in Phase 1C forward and to begin vaccinating that population as well. CDC's framework was a guide to the states, and states have adjusted the categories to their unique local population. CDC uses the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency definition of essential workers. States are prioritizing essential workers that are important to their local economies. For example, many Midwestern states are including agriculture workers in their essential workers category. And as bio, we've asked that states include biotechnology employees involved in research and manufacturing to be included in this category of essential workers.
Yeah, and we also, echoing bio's efforts, have reached out to the Cuomo administration to also ask that, essential workers that are doing R&D work in labs be allowed to be vaccinated early. I think right now, obviously New York has adopted the 65 and moved up Phase 1C, and I think it also is immunocompromised individuals in that phase.
Yeah, and I pulled the New York Phase 1A and 1B, which the website kind of currently lists as those groups that are currently eligible for vaccination, and it is pretty broad and includes a lot of different groups like healthcare workers, first responders, public health, corrections officers, school staff, grocery store workers, public transit, and those older than 65. So
yeah, anecdotally, we're seeing a lot of particularly school, like teachers and those that are getting vaccinated in our local community, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and I think that the states are, CDC put out this guidance, the states put out even more specific guidance, and then it really kind of comes down to the sites of care to get the vaccine out to folks. And so, we've been hearing stories from around the country about, extra doses at the end of the day going to anyone who's in the grocery store and things like that. So I think that, it's not as kind of clear cut in terms of the categories and dividing the population up as we may like, but at least the vaccines are getting out. So.
Yeah, it's always, it always looks better on paper than it does in
Yes.
actuality. I don't care what it is. Any mass scale effort is going to have it's going to have some on the fly decisions.
Yes, yes. Especially when there's such a lofty goal of 100 million vaccines in the first 100 days. So
Yes.
So moving on to the next slide. So as vaccines are rolled out, there's continuous monitoring of vaccine safety. A number of existing safety monitoring systems that are used for routine vaccines are also being utilized for COVID-19. These systems span FDA, CDC, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and Department of Defense, and are a mix of active surveillance, passive surveillance, and database monitoring. Next slide, please. And there's also a new system that's being used for the first time with COVID. vSafe is a new CDC smartphone-based monitoring program for COVID-19 vaccine safety monitoring that uses text messaging and web surveys to check in with vaccine recipients after vaccination. Participants can report side effects and health impact events after COVID-19 vaccination, and it triggers active telephone follow-up by CDC for reports of significant health impacts. This also captures information on pregnancy status and enables follow-up on pregnant women.
Amy, is this system random? How do they choose who they're texting?
No, so when you get your vaccine, you should get an information sheet from the person administering your vaccine, and on there should be a link to go to download the vSafe.
Okay.
Or to sign up for vSafe. So
it's an opt-in.
It's an opt-in text phone or cell phone text-based system. It's not an app or anything like that. If you opt in, you'll get a periodic text messages checking in, just saying, you got your vaccine yesterday. How are you feeling today? Do you have any side effects? And then if there's anything significant, you may get a call from CDC.
And then just a housekeeping, I know some of you are raising your hand. We are trying to take all Q&A in the questions in the Q&A or in the chat box to the panelists. So for those of you raising your hands, please just type your questions in. Thanks.
And then next slide, please. So the side effects that are frequently seen with the authorized vaccines are relatively common among vaccines. Sore arm and pain at the injection site, headache, tiredness, muscle aches, chills, and fever. For both vaccines, more side effects were reported after the second dose than the first. So where possible, employers should factor this in and make accommodations such as scheduling vaccines at mass clinics the day before a day off and allowing sick leave for any potential side effects.
So we do have a question around the side effects. And the question is, do you have information regarding the type of patient groups that seem to be having extreme allergic reactions?
So I know that NIH, FDA, and CDC are actively investigating those allergic reactions. The box down at the bottom has some of CDC's preliminary data that shows that those cases of anaphylaxis after the vaccination with the Pfizer vaccine were in December 11.1 cases per million doses administered. I know that CDC published this data last week, and so that has a little bit of a breakdown, but I think that given what we've saw over the weekend with Moderna's vaccine in San Diego, I think that they are still doing a lot of investigating into both the potential cause of those allergic reactions as well as the patients who are experiencing them. Currently, CDC is recommending vaccination unless you've had an allergic reaction to a vaccine previously. If you have general allergies or are allergic to eggs or things like that, they are not, or they are still recommending vaccination.
And are there two questions. One is, I definitely agree, and I think it's a very practical piece of advice to schedule. We have friends that are obviously physicians, and they said they scheduled their second dose, just knowing what might happen before their days off. So I think that's smart and practical. And then the other question is, do you think that are there groups that or individuals that should try and not do a drive-through, vaccination, but should try to do it in a physician setting or a hospital setting in this case?
So even at drive-through clinics, it's recommended that you stick around for 15 to 30 minutes after the vaccination, just to make sure that there aren't those kind of immediate side effects. So no matter where you get the vaccine, you should wait around, and the immunizer should advise you to do that and make sure that you are complying with that, so that, if something does happen, you're in a kind of controlled environment. I think that, if you do have a history of allergies or have some of those concerns, I think that trying to go to a pharmacy or another provider office is, a good idea, just to put that sort of control in. But you should, be able to be monitored and get the appropriate care regardless of where you are getting vaccinated.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. And then just pointing out that both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are mRNA vaccines, and so other vaccines using other technologies may have different side effect profiles and rates. So just something to keep in mind as more vaccines kind of come into the fold. And then on my next slide, I think this is my second to last one. So to help get evidence-based information out on these vaccines, BIO launched a website in December called COVID Vaccine Facts. The site provides answers to more than 20 frequently asked questions about the COVID-19 vaccines in both English and Spanish, and we hope to be adding more languages soon. We try and answer the questions, not in very scientific language, with a lot of infographics to help illustrate the points we're making. We are working on adding new questions, both because we know that our initial list of questions was not complete, and the landscape is constantly changing, and people are asking new questions as the vaccines start rolling out. We're also making the content available to partners who can repurpose the information. We're not, kind of trademarking anything or anything like that. We just want this information to get out to the public, and so are happy if others want to use what we've developed. And then on my last slide, I have the URL for COVID Vaccine Facts, which is just covidvaccinefacts.org. I also have the link to the COVID pipeline tracker, where I got the data for my first slide about kind of the breakdown of vaccines and therapeutics and treatments, a really handy compilation of information that's updated every week. And then BIO's COVID website includes resources for businesses, patient support programs, and information on BIO's priorities with regard to COVID as well. So with that, I'm done with my slides. Happy to take any questions or pass it over to Joe. And
we've got just a couple questions here that I think we'll want to hit now. And I'm sure more will come in for you and Joe at the end. We've had a couple questions around pregnancy, pregnant women. Will pregnant or nursing women be eligible for the vaccine? And then what do you tell pregnant women who are worried about, potential impact on their, on the fetus and long-term effects?
So taking the first question, CDC is not excluding pregnant women from vaccination. So their guidance is really, if you're a pregnant woman and are interested in vaccination, have a conversation with your healthcare provider about, the upsides and downsides of vaccination, and, make that decision together after that conversation. In terms of impact on the fetus, these are RNA vaccines. So they contain a very small piece of the viral genome that is encapsulated in a lipid nanoparticle, and that is injected. When it is injected, it sparks a reaction in your cells to produce a protein. It never gets to the nucleus of your cell. And so it doesn't interact with your DNA. It just kind of gets a reaction going, and then it's destroyed and goes away pretty quickly thereafter. So it's not that you're now going to have COVID RNA in your body indefinitely. It's a pretty short process. And so there's really no impact that we've seen on people's DNA, on DNA of babies, anything like that. So I think that even though these are new technologies and it's good to be asking these questions, we haven't kind of seen any evidence to spark any concerns.
Thanks. All right, let's hear from Joe about the specifics of the distribution process.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let me queue up your slides here, Joe. One sec.
Sure.
Those are not your slides.
Yeah, that's a...
Where we go? Here they are.
I'm glad you're doing this rather than me, because I'd be messing it up nicely.
That's okay. I had to move all of our heads away from the button that let me do this. So rock and roll, Joe.
All right, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining. Amy gave us some great information on the COVID rollout. What I want to talk about is some of the pitfalls you might run into and some of the challenges as we see this mRNA-based vaccines and the other vaccines from Johnson & Johnson and some of the other providers as they bring them out to market. So I'm an engineer by trade. I've been working with pharmaceutical cold chain for 30 years internationally. So there's a lot of things we've seen in the market, a lot of changes that have occurred, especially with the new mRNA-based vaccines that I just want to address for those people that are administering at the end. So next slide, Derek, please. So to give you a little background on who we are, PHCBI might not be a brand that you're familiar with. Our pedigree goes back to both Sanyo and Panasonic since the 60s. We've been producing products, ultra-low freezers, refrigerators, high-performance fridges, and all the way through the whole cold chain line throughout all of our product lines since the 60s. So with that, there's a lot of lessons we've learned in how to produce these products and some of the challenges that our end users or the end users that administer vaccines have run into. So next slide, Derek, please. So as Amy talked about, we have two vaccines that are on the market now, both from Pfizer and Moderna. And the challenges for both of them are a little bit different. When it gets down to the final administration, they're very similar. But as Amy mentioned, the Pfizer vaccine requires a little bit different storage for the transport and distribution than it does for the final administration. So Derek, I think these slides have some, there we go. So this is the first time any of us have been dealing with an mRNA-based vaccine. And normally with vaccines, except for the ones Amy cited for chickenpox and shingles, from the Merck vaccines, those are frozen, but now we're dealing with ultra low temperatures that are needed for Pfizer and Moderna. And it creates some challenges, mainly because the end users, the people that are administering the vaccines typically aren't used to working with ultra low freezers. And in many cases, they're not used to dealing with -20 freezers as well. And I want to talk about, if you're looking at purchasing new product or you're looking at using the product you already have, some of the things that you want to be concerned with related to how you're storing these vaccines and what you need to do to be able to maintain their integrity as you move through the supply chain. Next slide, Derek, please. I think this one still has some transitions to it.
It does.
So again, at the end here, I'm going to spend a little time focusing on the 2 to 8 requirements and some of the challenges related to that. So as we've seen, we are a manufacturer of ultra low freezers. Like every other manufacturer, we've been deluged with requests for producing these. We make them around the world, but we're trying to keep up with supply like everyone else has. But now we're starting to see the shift toward the administration end with the -20 freezers that are required for the Moderna vaccine, as well as the 2 to 8 that are required for all of them. And that's where some of the challenges might come into play. And I'll explain why, as Derek, as you move to the next slide here. So what happened? So I'm going to go back a little bit in time to 2012 when a DHHS Inspector General report came out related to the Vaccine for Children program. Amy alluded to that a little bit. That's for the underprivileged, the program from the CDC for underprivileged children. They have a toolkit, and the CDC relies on a lot of the guidance that the CDC provides for the states comes from the VFC toolkit. And what was found back in 2012 is that there was some concerns on the viability of vaccines and through the cold chain. So the cold chain at the time for most vaccines, the majority of them, is just your simple 2 to 8 requirements for vaccines. But now we're seeing that expanded again to the -80 and -20 requirements. So it's really put a lot of stress and challenges on how they're handled and how they're administered. So with that, the CDC took some action back in 2015, which I'll explain on my next slide, Derek. So what happened is if you look at vaccine refrigerators, you might look at it and say, it's just a fridge. Why does it really matter on how the vaccines are administered? The challenge is as we've seen through the VFC toolkit and the guidance from the CDC over the years, is that they're in most cases recommending purpose-built vaccine refrigerators. But what I want to point out is just because a refrigerator is purpose-built doesn't mean vaccines are going to be safe under all conditions. So what the CDC did is they worked with NSF and ANSI back in 2015 and formed a committee which is comprised of CDC, state health authorities, pediatricians, industry experts to come up with a standard for the storage for vaccines. So the result of that is a new NSF-ANSI standard, which was approved for public release on January 13th. So this just happened last week. I sit on that committee with the other experts in the industry, and we've been working with it for the last 5 years, working with NIST, working with CDC, working with the state health authorities to try to come up with a standard for vaccine refrigerators and freezers. So there is a new standard that's coming out, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the challenges we ran into in creating that standard. Next slide, please, Derek. So the current landscape is, as I mentioned, it's a new NSF-ANSI standard. One of the biggest focuses we've had in the committee is protecting vaccines from freezing. As you know, and as we've seen the guidance, even with the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine, once it's in its refrigerated state, and for all traditional vaccines, protection from freezing is important. With traditional vaccines, once they're frozen, they become ineffective. And there's really no way to tell just by looking at them, whether they've been frozen or not. We know that in most states, there's requirements for external monitoring with monitors that will measure the temperature. But some of those monitors, there's no standard for those. So some of those monitors can have big, what we call buffers on them that might not simulate the vaccine temperatures. So it's created a challenge. So some of the things that we will see in the standard as it's released, we had a vote on it. It passed unanimously for the standard last week. And it's being reviewed by, I'm looking at the name, the Council of Public Health Consultants now. And then it's going to be sent out for public release in a few weeks. So we'll have this very soon, but I wanted to point out some of the things you need to be concerned with in the meantime. Protection from freezing and very tight uniformity requirements are required for these new refrigerators to keep vaccines viable and safe. Next slide, please, Derek. So again, protection from freezing is one of the big key concerns. This has been outlined in the Vaccine Storage and Handling Toolkit that the CDC has produced. But some of the changes we're going to see to the market is that the display has to read intensive a degree on these refrigerators. The reason for that is we're dealing with 2 to 8. There's only a 2-degree buffer between freezing temperatures and that 2 degrees. I'm talking degrees Celsius here. It's really important that we make sure that we're maintaining the viability of those vaccines. So they are moving forward, again, continuing to suggest dedicated medical grade refrigerators. And the guidance right now is no domestic or commercial grade refrigerators. So you might wonder why. Why does it have to be purpose built? And what are the benefits with that? So next slide, please, Derek. So on top of that, just to change streams a little bit, is we have mandate from the EPA. within the industry to change the refrigerants we're using in these refrigerators. So we have almost a perfect storm situation here where the entire industry is moving toward new natural refrigerants or types of refrigerants that don't produce global warming or produce effects on the ozone layer, which has been addressed in years past. So that's created some challenges for the manufacturers of these products to make sure that we not only are being environmentally friendly, but we're also producing products that maintain very tight temperature uniformity. And that's created a challenge in the industry. So next slide, please, Derek. So there are some advantages with energy consumption. I'll get on that a little bit. But what this has meant for us, what I'm showing you here is some slides we did on testing of our prototype units for release into the market. We not only have to test what the refrigerators will do at all points in that refrigerator where vaccine could be stored, but we also have to test it when it's full. And that's the big challenge. The profiles for how the temperature in a standard or even a purpose-built refrigerator will change the more you stack it up. So we all know that during regular vaccine season, which happens before kids go back to school in August, September, that the practitioners are getting all these vaccines in, and they're stacking their refrigerators in many cases as full as possible. What that can possibly do is compromise the storage conditions inside those refrigerators and could create some places in refrigerators where the products are exposed to freezing temperatures. And as I mentioned, once it's frozen, it becomes ineffective. So how do we avoid that? That's the big key, and the big concern that we have is we've come up with the standard. So next slide, please. Slide, please.
I had a quick question, Joe. Do you guys also have guidance for, procedural things like, how often people should or shouldn't open the door to the refrigerator or anything like that? Is there any sort of, kind of real-time tracking? Do you know the performance of the fridge with, general use if people are opening the door to get the vaccines out?
Yes, there is. One of the things we found within the committee, and there was a lot of work done by Michael Chernosky from NIST in relation to this. She did and this is published on this website, she did a study of how often refrigerator doors are opened. And we found out, and this is built into the standard, that there could be as much as a 3-minute door opening as a standard. And that's usually done when inventory is changed in and out of the fridges. So within the standard, we have a requirement for a 3-minute door opening. And what happens to the refrigerators when you leave the door open that long? Obviously, the temperature is going to rise. But the key for us was to ensure that we came back to that 2 to 8 degree temperature within 15 minutes within the standard. To make sure we weren't compromising vaccines and not allow that fridge to drive all the way down into freezing temperatures, which again could compromise vaccines. So these fridges have to be very specific on how they handle those temperature excursions.
Okay.
So the challenge is freezers as well have challenges. So as we know, the Moderna vaccine requires storage temperatures before they're administered between 15 and minus 25. The typical solution that a lot of people have always relied on is frost-free freezers because they're great for convenience. They don't build up ice on the inside. They don't have frost. The challenge is frost-free freezers usually use high-power heaters or hot gas to melt the ice periodically, so you're not getting frost inside, just like your home fridge and your home freezer. You don't want to see frost inside, so they use high-power heaters. The problem is that it can drive the temperatures inside that freezer very high during those cycles because a lot of them rely on timers that doesn't take into account whether the door has been open, whether you put new product in there, how close it is to the higher temperature range. And that could cause big temperature spikes inside the freezers. And it's very easy for those freezers to easily rise above minus 15 during the frost. So you might look at that and say, okay, the Moderna vaccine or the Pfizer vaccine comes in 2 ml vials. They're in these big pizza boxes, as they call them, or these big packs. So why would you worry about that? The problem is how long and how often it rises above that minus 15 cutoff, and how long those vaccines are sitting in that freezer exposed to those constant temperature spikes that may happen every few hours. So the solution, and I'll talk about this in best practices here, the solution might be to consider a high performance freezer. Look on Energy Star. There is a listing from manufacturers of high performance freezers versus just general reagent grade. And look at one possibly with a manual defrost. So what the manual defrost will do is avoid those temperature spikes. It keeps the temperature very stable as you move through your cold chain requirements. Next slide, please, Derek. So the takeaways for this for refrigerators is if you take anything out of this, until NSF, the standard is called 456, and it will be out soon. It will take a while for them to be tested, for the testing agencies to get used to this standard. But until then, some of the advice I would give is if you're putting vaccines, especially the COVID vaccines, in refrigerators, leave room for air to circulate. Don't overload them. On under-counter refrigerators, if you're using those, don't put product on the hump at the rear of the refrigerator. That's the area, it's the cutout for where the compressor and the refrigeration system is. There's a little flat shelf on there that's created in many under-counters. If it has one, don't put the products on the hump. We've found through testing that can expose products to adverse temperatures in many products that are out there. Encourage shorter door openings, Derek, you talked about that. Don't make that fridge drive rapidly to colder temperatures. There's a lot of fridges out there that have rapid recovery cycles, great for your lettuce and your steaks, not so good for vaccines. You don't want to freeze those vaccines. Pay attention to the load lines that are inside most of these, especially the bigger refrigerators. There's usually a big red mark on the inside. Don't stack above that red mark because you could be putting product at risk right underneath the fans in those bigger units. If you're purchasing new ones, request temperature mapping data from manufacturers. Manufacturers, and we're no different, will like to say, hey, this is approved and this is an ideal situation for storage of vaccines. Ask for temperature mapping data, both full and empty, on those refrigerators to make sure that you're keeping the vaccines viable if you're looking for new ones. Even if you're not looking for new ones, ask the manufacturer for the data on their testing on units you already have. And don't assume that purpose-built refrigerators will protect vaccine viability. Ask for that testing data. Get the manufacturer to back up their product with that information. So moving on to the next one, the takeaway for freezers. Again, freezers are covered under the NSF standard. We've looked at the requirements, some of the pitfalls and challenges. Just like refrigerators, don't overload the freezer. Leave room for air to circulate. On under-counter freezers, they have a hump on them as well. Don't put your product on top of that hump. It could be warmed up by the compressor that's sitting underneath it. Pay attention to your load lines. Again, purchasing, if you're looking at new freezers, ask for the temperature data, especially the defrost spikes, to make sure you're staying within the guidelines. Consider purchasing a manual defrost freezer if you're looking for freezers. There's lots of them out there. Lots of manufacturers, including us, provide them. And make sure that the freezer can maintain the desired temperatures. Many commercial freezers can't. So a lot of practitioners may be looking at a commercial freezer or something that's used in a kitchen or in their cafeterias of their hospitals. Many commercial freezers cannot hit those -20 requirements and maintain it properly. So make sure that you're looking at the specs of the freezers that you're putting, especially the Moderna vaccine that requires the -20 storage. Make sure you're looking at that very closely. Next slide, please, Derek. So some of the things we've seen, this is one of our products. It's called TSU4W. And again, we're trying to address all the issues. This is a recently released product for us. It's a 3 cubic foot undercounter. There is a lot of challenges out there about how much capacity a fridge actually has because there's many different standards. And we know there's a lot of confusion. A lot of people, a lot of end users will say, well, I only need a 5 or a 3 cubic foot fridge because this is how many vaccines I can store in a 3 cubic foot fridge. Make sure the manufacturer is accurately representing the storage space that you can actually use inside that refrigerator. The last thing you want is to purchase a fridge you think is big enough and find out the actual usable space isn't big enough. That's a key, and there's been a lot of confusion out there. There's not a lot of guidance on how much vaccine you can actually store in a particular refrigerator. So we're trying to change that narrative in the market. Next slide, please, Derek. So with freezers, again, we produce ultra low freezers as well, changing streams a little bit. We're seeing, as I mentioned, we're seeing a lot of changes out there. One of the things to consider, most manufacturers are producing eco freezers now using a new refrigerant. It actually provides better uniformity on these on these ultra low freezers. And there is energy rebates available through Con Ed in New York, through many of the practitioners, many of the providers. The power utilities do provide energy rebates in many parts of the country on these freezers. So if you're purchasing them, you're looking at budget constraints, look for those rebates. They can often extend well over $1,000 for an ultra low freezer purchase using the new technology. So keep that in mind if you're budget constrained, that those rebates are available in many areas. And if they're not, ask your provider to provide it, because the energy consumption on these new eco freezers is much less than it has been on traditional ultra lows. So next slide, please, Derek. So for us, Karl Radosevich and our product group has worked with coming up with tools for our products and how much of the different types of vaccines you can actually store inside our fridges and freezers. So he's done a lot of extensive research on this, on the pizza boxes that are provided by Pfizer, and the packaging from Moderna. And we looked very closely at how many vials you could actually store in one of our refrigerators accurately in the space where it is appropriate to put vaccines without causing issues with freezing temperatures or inappropriate storage temperatures within our products. So keep that in mind. Ask manufacturers. A lot of manufacturers have done this. Looked at how many vaccines can be stored inside these products, and of course for us, we have a product range that goes all the way from -150, not appropriate for the COVID vaccine, but it is used in the production, and all the way through from -80 to the +4, +5 high performance refrigerators. So next slide, please, Derek. In closing on this. And we do have all sorts of tools out there. So reach out to us if you're looking for information specific on what we have available. We do still have product available. It's in short supply, but it is still available. We have more products coming in to be able to meet this requirement. But again, our products are built specifically for dealing with vaccines and high temperature requirements, high uniformity requirements for all the products in the market. So keep that in mind. Those the things to consider are probably going to be really important. I'm not seeing a lot of chatter about that in the news media, but keep that in mind, that you want to make sure that if you're administering the COVID vaccine, that you're keeping those products viable and that you're using the best performance refrigerators and freezers that you can, considering the fact that between dose 1 and dose 2, a lot of those vaccines are going to be sitting in that refrigerator for extended periods of time. You don't want to refreeze them. That's going to be important as we move forward. I think that's it for me, Derek. Next slide.
Okay.
Other than to mention that our Energy Star is a good go-to source for the products that are available on the market, including ours and including other manufacturers. So use that as a source if you're looking for high-performance refrigerators and freezers, to reach out to the manufacturers that produce them.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. We've had some questions about whether these slides will be available, and I've said to a few people in the chat that they could reach out to me, and that I would ask both of you if it's okay with either of you. If folks ask for a copy of these slides, is it okay if I PDF them and send them out to folks that request them?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
That's great.
And we can
really
post them on our website as well.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, we can do that. Amy, there was one question that we didn't quite get to with yours, but I think it sums up a lot of what people are thinking about when they see, the top line headlines of how many doses are either bought or available. How do people parse, really kind of the 100 million doses headline with, when they actually ask their vaccination, centers, and they say they can't take appointments due to shortages. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because we have, I think we have a decent understanding of where the big numbers are. And I think one of the challenges that people see are when they see the big numbers and then they go to say, well, when does this get to people around me? I think people are having trouble with kind of that stage of the distribution system.
Yeah, so the available vaccines are being allocated by the federal government. So HHS and Operation Warp Speed are allocating the vaccines to the various states based on an algorithm they have. I don't know all the details about whether that's based on the number of cases that are being seen in the state, whether it's based on kind of population. But so, depending on how many vaccines are coming into the state and the demand, we're definitely going to continue to see shortages until there's, manufacturing kind of really ramps up, or we have additional vaccines available through authorization or approval.
Yeah.
Amy, we've seen in the news yesterday, in particular for New Yorkers, that Governor Cuomo has reached out directly to Pfizer about providing additional doses for New York, being able to procure them for distribution in the state. We haven't seen that with other states yet. Can you tell us a little bit about how and why that might work or not?
So, there's nothing that kind of precludes a state from directly contracting with a manufacturer or health systems. Operation Warp Speed has these procurement contracts to really kind of try and make this seamless and efficient across the country. In terms, all of these companies have R&D and procurement deals, not only with the US, but with other governments around the world, as well as with like the COVAX effort that is an international purchasing effort for low and middle income countries. And so, a state could work with a specific manufacturer to try and get more doses, but given the commitments globally, I don't know where that state would kind of fall into the line of getting doses. So, New York could get a deal with Pfizer, but that doesn't necessarily mean Pfizer is going to jump to the top, or New York's going to jump to the top of Pfizer's list for the newest vaccine doses coming out.
Joe, an interesting question here. So between Moderna and Pfizer, these vaccines really represent kind of the first, mRNA products that have ever hit the market. Do you see this as kind of the tip of the iceberg, or where things are going in terms of establishing an infrastructure for other mRNA, either vaccines or therapeutics that would come out of either Moderna or BioNTech or any of the companies working in this space?
Good question, Derek. I'm not absolutely sure that's going to be the case, because as we've seen, both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are mRNA based. Moderna seemed to have a bit of a head start over Pfizer on how to keep them stable at higher temperatures. I suspect, although I'm not an expert in this, I suspect that a lot of research will be going into how to keep these mRNA-based vaccines stable at these higher temperatures, because long term, I would suspect that storing all these mRNA-based vaccines and therapeutics as they become developed in -80, and then dealing with the challenges of distribution might not be a long-term solution. So I suspect that we're going to start seeing them, if not reaching the 2 to 8 temperatures, at least the higher temperatures like Moderna's done.
And nice tip of the iceberg pun there, Derek. I noticed that.
It was honestly, it was unintentional. I was trying to think of anything else in terms of what was coming next, but I'll take it. For everybody on the call, this has been really great and informative, and this is something that we think can be shared pretty widely. So this talk should be up on YouTube hopefully by the end of the day. And I want to thank both Amy and Joe for joining us today. Again, if you want the slides, you can send an email to me at derek.brand@newyorkbio.org. And again, Amy and Joe, thank you very much for joining us. This has been terrific.
Thank you. And also we're going to do a sort of a 2-part vaccine update for everyone. And on February 9th, same time, same place, we will have a number of Pfizer executives, including the head of North America Vaccines, to talk about their process, and not only their development, but their distribution process. So thank you so much, Amy and Joe. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.